never paid much attention to school security until the day the new guard arrived. I was a sophomore at Lincoln High, still trying to adjust to the rhythm of classes and after-school routines. But from the moment Mr. Turner started working there, something felt off. At first, I noticed only small details. During breaks and in the quiet corridors, I'd catch glimpses of him, standing unusually still near the entrance of empty classrooms, his eyes fixed on every movement as if he were studying us. He wasn't loud or threatening in any overt way, just oddly intense. Some of the other students joked that he seemed to know exactly when we'd linger in the hallways, but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that he was watching me a little too closely. One afternoon after class, I stayed late in the library to finish a project. As I was packing up, I noticed Mr. Turner in the dim corridor outside, his posture rigid, his gaze locked on me through the glass panels of the library door. I tried to shrug it off as paranoia, but the feeling only grew stronger. Over the following weeks, his behavior became increasingly intrusive. I would see him in unexpected places. Near the stairwell when I was leaving, pacing silently in the empty hallways during lunch breaks, or even standing near my locker as if waiting for something. His presence was constant and unnerving. He'd sometimes ask, in a flat, almost emotionless tone, "Did you stay after class again?" Or, "I noticed you were alone today," as if he had memorized every detail of my day. The turning point came one chilly autumn evening. I was leaving school later than usual, heading toward the exit in a nearly deserted corridor. As I walked, I heard footsteps echoing behind me. Glancing back, I saw Mr. Turner, his figure barely illuminated by a flickering hallway light. My heart pounded. I quickened my pace, but he matched me stride for stride, leaving school grounds and following me all the way to the bus stop. At the bus stop, with only a few dim streetlights and no one else around, I finally confronted him. "Why are you following me?" I asked, voice trembling. For a long moment he just stared, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke in a measured, almost gentle tone that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm just doing my job, kid. I notice details. I remember faces. You wouldn't understand." I stepped back, confusion mixing with a deep, mounting dread. I had heard rumors that Mr. Turner had been dismissed from his previous position for overstepping boundaries, for being too invasive. But I never expected him to turn his attention on me. Scared and deeply disturbed, I stepped back, my heart pounding in my ears. At that moment, someone else approached the bus stop behind me. Mr. Turner glanced quickly at the newcomer, at me, and then turned around and walked back in the school's direction. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept imagining his cold gaze following me in every dark corner of the school and even on my walk home. I began to question every little detail of my daily routine. Was he really everywhere? Had he memorized my schedule, my habits, even the moments when I was most vulnerable? The next day, I mentioned my encounter to a friend, and whispers started circulating. Some said Mr. Turner was too nosy, that he had a dark past involving a string of similar incidents at his old school. Others claimed he was simply lonely or troubled. But for me, it wasn't just a rumor, it was a personal violation. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak in the hallway, every flicker of a light made my skin crawl. It was as if he had become a permanent, unwanted shadow in my life. I eventually reported my concerns to a teacher, but the administration brushed it off, saying Mr. Turner was simply doing his duty. I wasn't convinced. A few weeks later, I was leaving the school after an evening study session when he caught up with me at the bus stop again. Standing alone under a flickering street lamp, Mr. Turner locked eyes with me. His gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if he wanted me to understand something unsaid. He stepped forward and asked in a low voice, "Do you know what I do with the details I collect?" His tone was not threatening, more like an eerie invitation to share a secret. I froze, unable to respond. Right then, thankfully, a bus pulled up at the stop, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The sudden arrival startled Mr. Turner. His face contorted with a mix of irritation and genuine fear. Desperate to escape his unnerving presence, I boarded the bus and watched him retreat into the shadows until he vanished from sight. Same evening, still trembling from that encounter, I told everything to my parents. The constant, unnerving gaze, his invasive questions, and how he seemed to know personal details I'd never shared. Alarmed, they went to the school, collected my documents, and arranged for me to transfer to another school. I still don't know what Mr. Turner's true intentions were. Was he simply a troubled man obsessed with details? Or was there something more sinister behind his fixation? All I know is that the memory of that night, the cold stare, his unsettling words, and the way he followed me in every shadow haunts me to this day. I'd always thought that school libraries were safe havens, quiet spaces where the only sound was the rustle of pages. But one autumn evening changed everything. I was finishing up a history paper after classes when I noticed him in the far corner of the library, a boy I hadn't seen before sitting alone at a table. As I stole glances between my textbook and the shelves, I realized there was something unnerving about him. He wore a faded hoodie and carried himself with an almost detached calm. When I finally gathered enough courage to speak, I asked, "Are you new here? I haven't seen you around before." He looked up slowly, his dark eyes assessing me as if he were reading through my thoughts. "Yeah," he said in a quiet, measured tone. "I just transferred from another school." We talked briefly. He mentioned that he didn't know many people yet and seemed genuinely out of place. His answers were polite but laced with an intensity one couldn't quite explain. Before long, our conversation dwindled, and I returned to my work. The next day after extra classes, I left school as usual. On the empty sidewalk near the school's entrance, I almost didn't notice him at first. But then I saw him standing there under a flickering street lamp, staring at me, waiting. My heart skipped a beat. Was it coincidence? Or had he been following me? My mind churned with possibilities. Maybe he was lonely, struggling to adjust to his new environment, and that's why he kept lingering. Couldn't be sure. I hesitated for a moment, then approached him. "Hey, are you waiting for me?" I asked. He nodded silently and, after a brief pause, added, "I thought we might walk together. Our homes are in the same direction, aren't they?" I considered it. After a long day, walking home with someone who seemed desperate for company wasn't entirely unappealing. Besides, I was tired, and I lived only a few blocks away. We started walking side by side along the dimly lit street. At first, the conversation was casual. He asked me small questions about my day, and I shared little details of my routine. But as we walked, his tone shifted. He began suggesting odd things, inviting me to check out a cool place he'd discovered, a spot he described with a disturbing enthusiasm. "Trust me," he whispered at one point, his eyes glinting in the low light. "This place is unlike anywhere else. It's where everything real shows itself." His words sent a chill down my spine. What did those words even mean? I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he was just trying too hard to be friendly, but I couldn't shake the unease growing inside me. By the time we reached my house, the street was eerily silent. I turned toward the front door, and he followed me every step of the way. Standing on my stoop, he said, "Do you really need to be home right now? We still have time. Walk a bit further, and you might see something amazing." I frowned. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he only smiled cryptically. I pushed open my door and slipped inside. Once inside, I waited a few minutes, gathering the courage to glance out the window next to the door. My heart pounded when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the driveway, staring directly at my house. Then, as if realizing I was watching, he abruptly turned and walked back down the street. I spent the rest of the night in a state of anxious confusion. The next day at school, I shared my encounter with my friends in the cafeteria. Their reactions were a mix of disbelief and concern. No one had heard of any new student transferring in, and the school was so small that everyone knew everyone's business. One of my friends said, "There's no way a new kid could just appear without everyone knowing. Are you sure you weren't imagining things?" I tried to explain every detail, but the more I talked, the stranger it sounded. That same day, between classes, I was hurrying along one of the quieter corridors when I saw him again. He was standing near a row of lockers, right next to mine, seemingly waiting. For a moment, I hesitated. Was he simply lonely, or was there something more sinister? I approached him, unsure of what to say. "Hey," I managed. He inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. After a brief pause, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur. "I'll be waiting for you after your next class. It's your last one, right? Physics. I'm gonna take you to that cool place I've told you about. Trust me, you'll like it." Not even waiting for my reply, he walked away. My heart hammered. I had never mentioned my schedule to him, and yet he knew exactly when my last class ended and which class it was. I tried to brush it off as a fluke, but his persistent invitations, his knowing glances, and his unnerving presence began to weigh on me. Unable to shake the unease, I approached a teacher and asked, "Has anyone transferred into our school recently?" The teacher looked puzzled. "No, there hasn't been any new enrollment this year," she replied. My stomach sank. Had someone managed to slip into our school unnoticed, with an agenda all his own? Had I really been interacting with a complete stranger? Totally creeped out, I rushed to my friends and told them everything. About our last encounter with that kid, the teacher's words, and my mounting dread. My friends insisted on accompanying me home that night, determined to ensure I wasn't alone. Together we walked out of the building, still discussing the inexplicable encounter. As we reached the school gate, my friends suddenly noticed a lone figure standing in the shadows a few yards away. A figure that looked exactly like the stranger from the library. Before anyone could speak, the figure turned and melted into the darkness, leaving us all in stunned silence. My friends urged me to report the matter to my parents and the school authorities. The next day, after a series of anxious conversations, I let out a sigh of relief. I never saw him again after that. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Who was the stranger? And where would he have led me if I'd accepted his invitation to that cool place? It's been a few years since I graduated, but those questions still send a chill down my spine. It had been a long day. My head throbbed from the sheer exhaustion of schoolwork, and my mind was clouded by the lingering tension of an argument with my girlfriend. We had been texting throughout the last period, and as soon as the bell rang, I called her, hoping to smooth things over. It didn't go well. She was frustrated, I was frustrated, and my patience was running thin. As I reached the row of lockers, still glued to my phone, I barely paid attention to my surroundings. Staring at her latest message, my feet carried me on autopilot to my locker. Without looking up, I keyed in my usual combination, but the lock didn't click open. I frowned. Did I mistype it? With a frustrated sigh, I re-entered the numbers. Still nothing. My phone vibrated with another message, and in a burst of anger, I slammed my fist against the door. To my surprise, the locker popped open with a metallic clang. Only it wasn't my locker. Instead of my books and hoodie, neat stacks of photographs stared back at me. Dozens of them. Picked one up, my breath hitching. They were pictures of students. Candid, unposed, taken without their knowledge. Some in classrooms, others in the hallways, a few even in the locker rooms. Uncomfortable, invasive angles. My stomach twisted. Who the hell took these? Then I saw the envelope. It was stuffed with cash, crisp bills packed tightly together. And beneath it, a small, clear plastic bag filled with pills. My pulse thundered in my ears. This wasn't just creepy, this was dangerous. Before I could react, a voice made my blood run cold. "Oh well, what do we have here?" I turned slowly. Standing a few feet away was Jake Connors, the last person I wanted to see. Jake was notorious in our school. A guy everyone knew to avoid. He had a reputation for handling business on campus, and judging by what I had just found, I had stumbled straight into something I shouldn't have. His smirk was anything but friendly. Behind him, two of his usual cronies flanked his sides like guard dogs. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body refused. "That's my locker," Jake said, stepping closer. "And it looks like you've been snooping where you shouldn't." It was an accident," I stammered. "I thought it was mine." Jake tilted his head, pretending to consider my words. Then, in an instant, his expression darkened. "Yeah? I don't think I buy that." Before I could say another word, he lunged. Instinct took over. I shoved the locker door closed, smashing it into his arm, and took off down the hall. "Get him!" Jake roared. I sprinted, my heart slamming against my ribs. Behind me, the sound of sneakers squeaking against the polished floor grew closer. They were gaining on me. I turned a sharp corner, nearly crashing into a row of lockers, and ducked into the nearest empty classroom. Pressing myself against the wall, I tried to slow my breathing. The hallway filled with the sound of heavy footsteps. "Where the hell did he go?" one of them hissed. "He couldn't have gotten far," Jake muttered. "Check the classrooms." Panic surged through me. My eyes darted around the dim room, searching for an escape. The only option was the window. It was risky, but I didn't have a choice. As quietly as I could, I slid it open and climbed out, landing in the narrow alley between the school buildings. The second my feet hit the ground, I ran. I could hear them behind me now, Jake cursing as he spotted me. I pushed myself faster, my legs burning. I tore around the corner of the building, and then, finally, I saw them. A group of my friends stood near the parking lot, laughing and talking. I barreled straight into them, gasping for breath. "Help!" I managed to choke out. They turned just as Jake and his crew came skidding around the corner. But the second they saw I wasn't alone, they hesitated. Jake's eyes locked onto mine, his expression twisted with barely contained rage. For a tense moment, I thought he might still try something. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his lackeys following close behind. My friends crowded around me, demanding explanations. I told them everything, my voice shaking. They urged me to report it, to go to the teachers. And after some convincing, I did. The next few days were a blur of meetings, questioning, and hushed conversations. But one thing was certain, Jake Connors didn't show up to school again. I never found out what happened to him. Whether he ran, got expelled, or something worse, I didn't know. But even now, years later, I sometimes wonder, what if I hadn't opened the wrong locker that day? And what would have happened to me if I hadn't run in time? Would it have been just a beating, or maybe, just maybe, something far worse?